So now I would like to give the floor to Arjen Wals. He is a professor of social learning and sustainable development. He also is the UNESCO chair in the same field and works at Wageningen University since 1992. His teaching and research focuses on learning for sustainability in times of accelerating change, also a title of a book where he's co-editor. His presentation is titled Science as Community, Sustainability-Oriented Trans-disciplinary Research. Okay, floor's yours.
I'd like to use the microphone.
Yes, okay.
Yes. Yes? No. Yes. Okay. Well, it's a pleasure, of course, to be here. It's somewhat ironic that I have to listen to people from the Netherlands, mostly so far, and that I have to meet my colleagues from Wageningen University that I hear a lot about in Wageningen, but hardly ever meet, that I meet them here in Germany. I wasn't supposed to be here alone today. I was supposed to be here with Scott Peters from Cornell University. We were jointly going to have a dialogue here, but about 3-4 weeks ago he let me know he could not make it. So I'm afraid it will be a monologue. But I'm pleased to know that Jacqueline's story sets the stage quite well for my story. So it also helps me going a little faster through the slides, because you're all ready for coffee, I'm sure. Science as community. I will talk a little bit about how we've come to interpret that, as opposed to science as commodity. And I was just realizing as I was listening to the presentation by Jacqueline that it's maybe not so much transdisciplinary research that I'm talking about, but transboundary research. Now, is this working or not? This is always nice. Yes. I come from a slightly maybe different position. I have maybe a strong normative position in that my driver is my concern about the well-being of the planet. My field is originally environmental education, which has evolved into learning for sustainability or sustainable development. And my chair is indeed connected to that. And so I look for ways to help people restore their connection with their community, with the place they live in, their connection to place, to fellow human beings, but also to other species. So planetary well-being, reconnecting with place and people, I see as important a part of my work. How can we do that? So unsustainability is a concern that I have, and many of you have. I've gone through the book and see a lot of sustainability-oriented projects. I also want to talk a little bit about the accelerating change that we are experiencing, I think, which is in part as a result of globalization, internet, social networking, the ICT, the information communication technologies that we are all part of that make us a little bit restless. Even as I speak, you're probably wondering, have there been any messages that come in this morning that might affect my life somehow? And you cannot check. That would be rude, although it's more and more accepted that you do. I don't see too many people with their laptop right now. Ah, thank you. You're not reading the newspaper, are you? No. And the confusion that there is about sustainability issues. There's no really universal agreement as to how we should live our lives in the most sustainable way. It is difficult to know what the most sustainable way of living is. In part because we don't live long enough to say 100 years from now that what we decided today turned out to be sustainable. We cannot know. So philosophically it's difficult, if not impossible. Hybrid learning as a concept, where these boundaries are crossed all the time, cross-boundary learning, if you will, in what I might call post-normal times, which is a concept that intrigues me by Vuntovic and Ravet. Some of you referred to that work. And I want to talk a little bit about phronesis as a way to organize, well, let's say, living knowledge in vibrant communities. Just as an appetizer, plastics, great chemical engineering feat, scientific marvel from the 50s. At the time, nobody really was thinking about potential consequences later in its usage when it was created, and we still benefit a lot from plastics in many ways. But we also see, this is by Chris Jordan, an American photographer who makes these huge canvases of these artifacts, and on the left side plastic baggies, on the right side plastic bottles. And if you're far away from these big screens, probably the size of this screen, then you see what you see on top, and if you walk closer, you see what it really is. And then he puts a number below it to make these statistics that are mind-boggling, more understandable or more meaningful. So on the left side, you see 60,000 baggies that are used, purchased every 5 seconds in the United States alone. Worldwide, of course, that's much more. 2 million of these bottles are used every 5 minutes in the United States alone. Now, if you know the story of plastic and the plastic islands that are being formed, a lot of people are aware of this, a lot of companies are aware of this, and a lot of communities are responding. And some of the projects that some of our students are involved in are looking into finding ways to separate plastics from the main garbage streams. The Plastic Hero campaign, for those of you from Holland, is one example of that. And different municipalities organize this in different ways. And people are informed, also children in schools, about recycling, reusing, reducing, etc. You all have heard of it. But, and I'm using the plastics to illustrate some of the confusion around sustainability issues. Not too long ago, on the Dutch news, there was a story about the burning of garbage, incineration of garbage in the Netherlands. That if you burn one, and then the newsreader said, if you burn one bag of garbage, it can provide your cell phone with energy for 2 months. And it was the lead into an item about Dutch incinerators. Of course, privatized waste management used to be a public function, has been privatized. So these companies that run the waste management, they need to make profit. And they've built these new incinerators that are supposedly green incinerators. That word green is used a lot these days. But the problem was that they're not burning the garbage up to 100% capacity, because we do not create enough garbage anymore to feed these incinerators. So they're not at 100% capacity. So what the solution was, it was to import garbage from Italy, where they have, in the Napoli area, a surplus of garbage they cannot deal with. So they're shipping it to Rotterdam, and they're now, it was a win-win. That was how it was presented. Of course, the people of the Plastic Heroes campaign, they were not so happy about it, because the message seemed to be, we need to produce, as good Dutch citizens, we need to produce more garbage to make sure that our incinerators, our green incinerators, run at 100% capacity. So you see also, and this of course adds to the confusion of the public about some of these issues. Here it says in Dutch, waste is food. And the energy company, or the waste management company of Amsterdam, is now called the waste energy company. So they're reframing themselves in more positive ways. There are also stories about these bottles not going into the ocean, but being used creatively. This is also, this is Ecotech, Andreas Frönze, a German, well, I would say almost activist, who figured, well, these bottles are not very biodegradable. In fact, they're not at all, which could be a very good quality when you build houses. So he's actually using these bottles, because they insulate well, for housing in mostly Central America, in disaster-struck areas, to rebuild homes. So he makes of a weakness a strength. So are these bottles bad, or can they be used? I mean, there's different interpretations about what plastics can do or mean. Coca-Cola company, they are a little bit concerned about all these stories about plastic islands. And they also are the biggest supplier of drinking water, bottled drinking water. And they have now developed the plant bottle with up to 30% plant-based, 100% recyclable material. Up to 30% could also be 0.5%. It's an interesting way of... So there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of confusion about many of these sustainability issues, and a lot of the sustainability issues require, I would argue, more localized, contextualized solutions where people frame in their own context what sustainability might mean to them. On the left side, you see a little bit about the magic of green marketing when we call everything green. You see the green aircrafts and the green skyscrapers, the traffic jam of Priuses, although they haven't been designed like Priuses, and the green plant bottles which you throw on the ground because something might grow eventually. And it leads to, well, if you look closely, nothing has changed really. And on the right side, the issue of materialism, which is of course being pushed in our society far more than sustainability. The drive to consume is infinitely greater than the drive to sustain. So where does this leave science in the equation? Many sustainability issues, whether they're related to environment, health, or inequity, they don't have single answers. They have multiple answers. And there are scientists on different ends of the continuum, of the spectrum. If you take runaway climate change and the IPCC report, classic example, you might argue 99% of the scientists agree that climate change is happening and it's caused by human beings and it's serious and we need to address it. And there's also 1% who will argue it's not that serious, it is a natural phenomenon. You still find those opinions. But that 1% gets about 99% of the media attention because it's more newsworthy. So citizens are exposed to this kind of information and they get confused. And if scientists don't know, then why should we change our lives? The Deepwater Horizon, how many of you, raise your hand if you know what that refers to? Okay, about 1 in 10. It's interesting, about a year and a half ago, this was the biggest ecological disaster ever to strike the planet. Oil platform in the Mexican Gulf, gushing. All that oil, every day you saw it on the news. They couldn't stop it. And British Petroleum would go bankrupt. They could never survive something of this magnitude. We don't hear much about it anymore. British Petroleum went back to profit last quarter, or last year, with over $1 billion of profits. What happened? What happened to the ecosystems? We don't really hear much about it. They're fishing again in the Gulf. Tourists are back. Maybe it was exaggerated, the ecological impact. Maybe the information doesn't get to us. Or maybe it will get to us years from now when we really know what the damage was. Same with Fukushima, the nuclear disaster in Japan. Calcium supplements for women after breastfeeding used to be the thing to do. It would save your bone structure for later in life. Now they say don't. It's not good for you. Getting your prostate checked as a man older than 50, that was a good thing to do. Now they're advising don't do it, because if you find cancer cells, they're probably very slow developing cancer cells. They may affect you when you're much older, but if you find out that you have cancer, you will want it treated, and it will lead to it will make you impotent, and a lot of your quality of life will go down. So better not to know. And maybe next year they'll find out a way to distinguish the rapid growing cancer cells from the slow ones, and then they will say, oh, you should get tested. So a lot of mixed messages. A lot of urban agriculture programs also featured in the examples at this conference. You know, locally grown community gardens, local vegetables, farmers markets, etc. But then there are questions about if you grow these vegetables in urban areas with a lot of air pollution, maybe these vegetables aren't so healthy and maybe we shouldn't eat them. So is that true or not? So a lot of confusion and a lot of different opinions, and science in a way has become an opinion in the public debate. And I think some of you may know E.O. Wilson, the biologist. He said this already more than 10 years ago. And I think it's telling. We are drowning in information while starving for wisdom. Where is the wisdom today? That's a big question. Post-normalism, I think many of these questions that I'm talking about now, they're characterized by complexity. They're highly complex, interrelated. The local is connected with the global. Past, present, and future are connected. They cannot be captured in models. They cannot be predicted with statistical accuracy. There's a lot of chaos, complexity, uncertainty involved, indeterminacy. It might change as we go, if we move on in time. The knowledge will shift, interpretations will shift. A lot of the knowledge is contested. People disagree about what needs to be done. It's kind of an erosion of trust. Science no longer an authority of truth. There's also a kind of a shallowness in the sense that people quickly will go to Google, Wikipedia, get information, get answers, hard to judge who put it there, with what kind of intent, what kind of underlying agenda. It will give answers, but you don't really know how trustworthy they are. But it might be quicker to look up, you know, something against itching on the internet than to go to your local doctor. It may save money with the changing health system. You're probably better off going to the internet and find answers and look at people's responses to those answers, look for the opinions. The democratization of knowledge, you could say, is a good thing. But there's also a shallowness, you know, when it says 44 people liked this answer, 3 disliked. And that's how people need to make judgments. So, and the other thing that's been mentioned before, there's the rise of the subjective. Being able to say in science also, I, as a scientist, I find this, or I have my insecurities too. I have my doubts about my knowledge. That's quite a different approach from the authoritative truth approach. If you go back in history a little bit, probably some of you know this book, Collapse by Jared Diamond. He looked at other civilizations in the past who were at the height, at the peak of their civilization. They disappeared rapidly. And he investigated. He wanted to know, why did they disappear so rapidly? And he found that people were transcending their ecological and technological boundaries. And rather than pulling together and co-learning their way out, they started competing for the last bit of resources and started actually fighting, which only led to a spiraling down. And the question, of course, that he also asked, how can we choose to succeed? How can we actually learn our way out of this unsustainability without... So the sense of community and community-based learning and co-creation, some of the words that are being used a lot in this group, are part of the answer, I think. But we also must realize that we are part of institutions, certainly the people working for universities, the highest level of education, that we also, in what we do, we strengthen certain perspectives and values and ways of thinking. And I think David Orr puts it quite nicely. The conventional wisdom holds that all education is good. The more of it we get, the better. But if we don't really think carefully and reflect on the underlying values that we are strengthening, it might just equip us to become more effective vandals of the earth. In another quote, he argues that most people who have big ecological footprints are not the uneducated, are not the people living in the slums. They are people with bachelor's degrees, master's degree, and PhDs. In other words, more education doesn't necessarily lead to more wisdom today. As a university professor, and I think many of you working for the university, and it's been mentioned already also by Jacqueline, there are some trends in science that are not very helpful for the kind of work that I think we are trying to do here. There's the trend of science for impact factors rather than science for impact or science for society, which I consider a counter trend right now. The trend of increasing efficiency, and I'll say a little more about these three trends, versus the trend of promoting authentic learning around real issues, and the science as commodity versus science as community. Just for fun, science for impact factors as a trend. If you look, this is not a scientific, I have to warn you, this is not scientific, but it's just intuitive, which I think is regaining popularity, intuition. If you look at the number of scientists, there's some increase in scientists worldwide, not so much in the Western world, mostly in the non-Western world. Apologies for the dichotomy. Increasing. Number of publications, exponential growth. Number of journals, exponential growth. Number of manuscripts submitted, exponential growth. Number of manuscripts rejected, exponential growth. Everything growth exponentially. In the last national, one of the papers, the Volkskrant in the Netherlands, there was a graph about number of recalled papers. Papers that turned out to be fabricated or plagiarized or exponential growth. Now, if you look at the time people have to read and to review, it's almost gone down to zero. Why would you review? You don't get any points for it. And time to read, no, you have to produce. So, put simply, everybody's writing for nobody. Maybe when you leave the room, you can write down your H factor. I'm curious what the average H factor is. H factor, for those of you who are not familiar with this system, and bless you, it is a measurement of finding out how you as a scientist are being cited by others. And there are different ways of measuring it. So does your work have any meaning beyond? And it's assumed that when you are cited that somebody actually read your paper, which is not always true. Anyway, there is a counter trend, because I think people are beginning to realize that there's a lot of inflation in this type of work, and it doesn't necessarily add to quality or quality of life. So Science for Impact, that's a report of our university, and you could say, as I think is the case in some universities, and maybe many, that might be a little bit like the green marketing, a bit of green gloss. We should have something about societal relevance in our mission statement, at least. But there is space at Wageningen University for, and there are some people here who will talk about it today and tomorrow, for engaging researchers and students in work with communities, for communities, rather than about communities, that leads to some kind of improvement in their lives. The Dutch, the VSNU, it's a Flemish-Dutch accreditation organization, uses societal relevance as one of its criteria now for assessing the quality of university programs. The extended peer review on the lower right goes beyond the peer review, the somewhat incestuous peer review inward looking, where colleagues from your field, from the same kind of journals that you publish in, review your work. No, you bring in these multiple stakeholders, which means you need to use a language that can be understood by multiple audiences, and they are part of the reviewing whether your work has merit. This is the efficiency bit. The trend, I think, is, students as input, throughput, output, get them in, get them out quickly, which also leads to a student-staff ratio that is somewhat unfavorable, because the more students you can teach in a setting like this is, from an economic perspective, more efficient, which is not helpful for this type of learning, which requires students and faculty to go out in communities, to do research in communities around, call it real-life projects, community-based projects, which is a different kind of, requires different forms of teaching: discovery learning, experiential learning, collaborative learning, action learning. There are lots of terms being used that refer more or less to the same thing. The other trend of science as commodity, we see the privatization of knowledge going on, more and more private universities, private high schools. Researchers have billable hours, so many billable days a year. They have to go to the market, get money from the market. And there's kind of a culture of accountability where people need to fill out forms to justify every hour they spend, etc., which leads to a lot of strategic behavior as well. Versus the science as community, where these sustainability issues that I talked about require representatives from different parts of society to jointly explore, investigate some of these issues. I only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to go faster. This is hard to read. Actually, I was delighted to see the big screen, because you may be able to read it, but I have this handout also behind the cameraman over there. Probably not enough, but for those of you who want to grab one on your way out, you can, if you cannot read it. But this kind of juxtaposes, and these are sometimes gradual differences, and you will find both of these sides within a university, I think. But some are more profoundly active on the left, and some more profoundly active on the right. I'm just going to let you look at this for a short minute. The word phronese is at the lower right here. The focus on ethically practical knowledge that is indispensable for the work of making context-specific value judgments about ends and means, which is quite a different approach from the science as commodity approach. Also, the idea of continuous growth is being questioned on the right side. Rather than focusing on continuous growth, it's more about dynamic quality. Not so much the maximization of profit, but maybe the maximization of meaning, which is a completely different idea. And some people are also talking not just about sustainable development, but sustainable contraction. In some parts of the world, we may need sustainable contraction rather than sustainable development. We could discuss all this. So, of course, we identify with the world on the right. I'm not sure, is that the left or on the right? Doesn't matter. But you can see we have excelled as higher education organizations on the left side. Disciplinary thinking still prevails, also in the high-ranking journals. And on the right side, where we are more engaged in communities, the issues are not so much driven by science or by experts, but they're much more driven by the members of the community. Whether this is a school community, a neighborhood, a CSO. And a slightly different way of presenting what Jacqueline presented. If you look at the two, kind of, in this case, two continuums, on the left side, you could say the level of participation by the stakeholders, and from low to the left to high to the right, and whether the goals are fixed or predetermined versus are they emergent or jointly set at the bottom. Then you get what I would call more instrumental I think you use transmissive approach. And on the lower right, I would say in the upper right, transactional approach. And in the lower right, you get a more emancipatory or transformative approach. And for each of these quadrants, you have different types of projects. On the upper left is an example. There are many examples of science shops working on questions from communities or CSOs. On the upper left about animal well-being and improving the quality of the housing of animals and what the consequences are and how you design different stables, etc. Where scientists frame it in their words, as in hypotheses, they do research on that, they have a report and they need to translate it in a way so that the people who commissioned it understand it. It's still kind of on the upper left, although the questions come from society. If you move to the right, there's another example of the Dutch science shop, a community garden in the town of Ede, which needs to be relocated. And the people, the group behind the gardens want to know how can we best allocate in this new area that we're moving to the spaces to the people participating, and how can we integrate, say, the people from an immigrant background in better ways. That's kind of being researched. People are being consulted, so there's more participation. But it's still research done by people from the university, although there is more input from the participants, from the stakeholders. And in the lower right, when you think about transition town movements or Detroit agriculture, things like that, where there is a change, a movement in which scientists participate, where research is almost, maybe not research as mining, or even research as co-learning, but research as activism, which is a step further even. Different roles of people from the scientific community, from instructors maybe, to maybe coaches in the upper right, and the lower right are facilitators and co-learners, which requires different competencies on the part of the researcher. Empathy has been mentioned. Speaking other people's languages, being able to listen, are some of those. The way the community is engaged is different, from passive receivers to active empowered, not receivers, participants, co-learners. The type of knowledge, from universal knowledge that can be applied, you know, whether in Bonn or Wageningen or even in Burundi, some universal laws or models are designed that are supposed to be, you know, transferred all over. Very context specific to contextual on the lower right. From knowledge transfer to knowledge circulation to knowledge co-creation. Now, I'm not saying that everything needs to be done in the lower right. I think there are too many issues for too many people to expect everybody to participate actively in every issue. That's impossible. There would be something like participation, saturation, or fatigue. So there will always be work done on the upper left. Important work, good work. So it's not that I'm suggesting we need to move from the upper left to the lower right, but it's useful to have these distinctions to help you position yourself where you are and where you might want to be. I'm almost at the end. Don't worry, I see you. This is something that Scott at Cornell uses. Very simple, which mimics in some ways also what Jacqueline was talking about, and the slide here after does that even more. But an analysis of the current state of play, what is, to an imagining, a visioning of what should be, what we want, to a transformative approach that leads to how can we change, how can we bridge the gap between what is and what we want. With all these factors that have been mentioned also, dealing with diversity, difference, tensions, pluralism, taking advantage of the creativity that you find in these heterogeneous communities of stakeholders, which means social cohesion is needed, because if you don't have social cohesion, then the diversity will block learning rather than enhance it. So there's a relationship between social cohesion and the possibility to use diversity. This is the same kind of cycle that many of you use, put maybe in some different words. The orientating, activating, the divergence in the beginning to the convergence in the end, where you start focusing on specific actions you work on. The roundabouts are there to indicate that action and reflection are simultaneously occurring throughout the process and not just an evaluation step at the end, which often is the case. That you also need to communicate with the people who are not actively engaged all the time, because otherwise you get some kind of an innovation elite of very committed, engaged, dedicated actors who lose touch with the people or the communities of which they are part. And then, so the trick oftentimes is to be ahead of the pack in such a way that the pack still wants to catch up. If you're too far ahead of the pack, it's like in cycling, then the pack will give up. They won't even chase you anymore. And that leads to elitism that you want to avoid. One word about hybrid, the Prius effect, synergy, creating a vital coalition of multiple stakeholders engaged in a common challenge using a blend of learning processes. George Siemens, he's also from Germany, not an ecologist as you might think. He uses the phrase learning ecology, but he's an ICT, has an ICT background. He sees this blended learning as the mixing of informal, non-formal learning and formal learning. He finds it important that we make transparent and explicit our values, our beliefs, our worldviews, our perspectives, the filters on the upper left. That learning is not just learning about things, or even it's not just learning for knowing, or even learning for doing. It's also learning for being and learning to transform, how to affect change in yourself and in others. That's more transformative learning. And ultimately, you see it on the lower right, it's not about data, information, or even knowledge. It is about wisdom. So it's about more generative processes, iterative processes that lead to wisdom, and where reflexivity has been mentioned as well, indeed, is a key topic. Some of you recognize these networks. There are many networks, many universities around the world that are already engaged in this type of work, although sometimes in slightly different ways. And some of you represent these networks at this meeting. Okay, I think with a little bit of, I think these counter trends are becoming stronger. I think networks like these will only help amplifying this important work. And I think this is pivotal in regaining trust in science in communities. So the civil, maybe some society or scientific disobedience is what we are representing, but it's gaining legitimacy thanks to the kind of work that I think we all do. Okay, that's it. Sorry for taking it.